Welcome to our online video series, Reading Hope in Trying Times. Our guest today is our good friend, Jennifer Grant. Jen is an author, speaker, and editor in the Chicago area. A graduate of Southern Methodist University and Wheaton College, Jen is the author of 5 books of nonfiction and 3 books for children. These include the memoir, When Did Everyone Else Get So Old? Indignities, Compromises, and the Unexpected Grace of Midlife, and Maybe I Can Love Your Neighbor Too. And her picture book on grief is called A Little Blue Bottle, and that releases in August of 2020. For more than a dozen years, she wrote feature stories, restaurant profiles, and health and family life columns for newspapers in the Chicago Sun-Times Media News Group and for the Chicago Tribune. She divides her work today between editorial consulting and creative work. She's participated in several times in Writing for Your Life conferences and webinars, and also curates the faith and food section on compassionate Christianity. So welcome, Jen.
Thank you.
So
perhaps to have this conversation in this funny time.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad to have you join us, Jen. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about how God's helped you through trying times and how that's been reflected in your books.
Sure. Recently, I was giving thought to this on another podcast, and the authors were not familiar with any of my work, as usually is the case. Unlike in your case, oftentimes when we're interviewed about our books, I've been surprised by how infrequently people really know what those books are. So I was interviewed and asked, tell us about what is your work? What is it? What are you really writing about? And I had to kind of come up with a good answer on the spot. And I think my books for adults have really been about talking about difficult or tricky moments in life or difficult periods, and really trying to tell the reader that I understand that's normal to have times where you feel confused and unsettled and upside down. You know, my first book is Love You More, The Divine Surprise of Adopting My Daughter. And that book is all about the adoption of my youngest, Mia, who came to us when she was a toddler, and she was born in Guatemala. And in the whole process of adopting her and identifying what country we would adopt from and so on, I had so many times of second-guessing myself or being confronted by people who wanted to talk, as I did, about the ethics of adoption. I started thinking about what is family. I would have random comments that people on my kids' school playground would say to me, and they would say, well, you know, you already have children that you've given birth to. Will you really love this child the same as you love those children? And so I had all these really difficult and unsettling questions. And the way that I dealt with it, like many writers, I really felt like the way I could address these questions and be honest with them and also sort of address them spiritually was to write about them. And so that book, Love You More, really goes into the sort of tangly parts of what it was like to adopt my daughter. And it really was a transformative time just writing the book, because I interviewed other people. I heard their wisdom. I was able to be contemplative, you know, in a way that if I was just thinking on the go, I wouldn't have given time and thought to. So that's one way that sort of my books have addressed trying times. You know, the more recent one that you mentioned, When Did Everybody Else Get So Old? That tells the story of my sort of 40s and turning 40 and then moving through that decade and facing a lot of the losses and milestones that a lot of people face in that time. I had friends who died during that period of time. In midlife, obviously, we have more friends who suffer from illness and who get divorced or who have other losses professionally or personally. And so that book was, again, me sort of trying to address the trying times in my life by writing about it and by giving myself the space to be reflective. So, and then the books for kids as well are books that, you know, when my kids were little, I always wanted to give them a sense of God's presence and a sense that they were loved by God. And yet a lot of the Christian books that I happened upon were a little bit more preachy, and I felt like they were a little more heavy-handed and sort of telling kids to behave, sort of like it's 2 weeks till Christmas, you better be good or you won't get your, presents from Santa. And I didn't want to present the divine in that way. So the Maybe picture books are really about kind of sparking spiritual curiosity in children and bringing, sort of complicated concepts around God to children in a way that they can kind of grasp. So joy can be swinging on a swing, and God's Spirit is known to us in our joy, and things like that. So those are some of the ways I've tried to navigate spirituality and also loss for children. And the new book that you mentioned that comes out this summer is called A Little Blue Bottle, and it's about a little girl who's experiencing grief and who has lost a really special neighbor friend. And in that book too, I just sort of wanted to gently introduce the idea to children that, it's okay to feel sad. It's okay to have our feelings and we don't need to sweep them away. We don't need to gloss over them. And we can also consider whether God is with us in these times and what that might look like.
Wow, that's a powerful lineup of things that you've written, Jen. And I'd really like to drill down a little bit more on the whole aspect of reading to children, in these kinds of times. There's so much on TV to be scared of. There's so much change in their life going on that in many cases, I'm sure younger children don't understand. What advice do you have on either reading books or talking to younger children in times like this?
Yeah, well, I think we're seeing right now that a lot of people are going to the arts and to not only literature, but to music and ballet and opera and theater. And they're finding resources online where they can share these events that maybe they can't be there in person to hear a symphony, but they can watch it on their computers. And I think letting kids of different sort of kids have different ways that they can communicate, just like all of us, obviously. And some of them are very good at putting their thoughts into words and describing their feelings in very, succinct ways. Others will have feelings that they can't express. And so by giving them different artistic sort of prompts, I think is one way that we can really embrace different kinds of kids. So for instance, if someone's feeling confused, and they're not able to say, look, I feel really confused, I feel unsettled, school's canceled, my parents seem stressed out, I don't know what's going on in the world. One way, obviously, to help them express that or just let them more fully feel those feelings is to watch a movie together that might have content related to that, or listen to a really complicated piece of music or a beautiful piece of music, or look at paintings. All these museums are showing their whole galleries, and doing kind of virtual tours. And I think it's great to remember that just like adults, children connect to different things. Not everyone wants to write a story about their feelings. Some might want to do a crazy finger paint, or, just like us, they need different ways to express all the things that are going on inside of them. And then obviously I think there are so many great books that kids can be read or read at this time. And I was going to give a shout out to a friend of mine, just wrote this book called Little Mole Finds Hope. And it's such a sweet book. I don't know if you've seen this one yet. Her name is Glennis Nellist. And I'll show you but this book, and I don't say this lightly because I get sent, as I know you do, a lot of books in the mail, and I'm asked to review a lot of books and to blurb them and so on. This book, though, is one of my very favorite works of children's literature that's come out in a really long time. And it's about a little mole who's underground and feels like everything's dark and hopeless. And the mother in the story sort of just gently points him toward different signs that there's hope in the world. And again, it's not a preachy book, and it's not one that is heavy-handed in any way, and it would be appropriate for any kid. It's not necessarily for a certain religious audience or whatever, but I think books like that, or just the books that I loved, and I was thinking before we talked today, what were the books that I returned to all the time as a little kid? And I always loved Beverly Cleary's books. And so over the last few years, I've been actually collecting sort of vintage copies of them. Like here's Henry in the Clubhouse. And I don't know if you know these ones, Ellen Tippett's
I
all
don't know
these,
Ellen Tibbetts, but I remember the Beverly Cleary books from when my children were young.
yeah, yeah. And actually, I was such a fan, and I just discovered this morning too when I was thinking about talking with you. I wrote a letter to Beverly Cleary when I must have been about 8 years old, and she sent back this beautiful kind of, it's sort of a form letter, but then on the back she wrote this really sweet note to me saying thank you for, what you said about my books. And that's another thing those of us who are writers can do right now, is to reach out when an adult or a child reaches out to us to say that they really appreciated our book. Now if you have a little more time during the day, maybe you'll write a letter like Beverly Cleary did to me, and that could be a real bright spot in a kid's life as well.
That's really a great idea. That's wonderful. So you've talked about, a few children's books from other authors that you like so well, and you mentioned your new one, but tell us about the ones that you've already released, because I think that those are really wonderful books too.
Oh, thank you. Well, I've been really honored actually the last few days on Twitter. I've heard from a number of people who are either members of the clergy or just have groups of children that they read to, and they've been saying, oh, I've been reading these in a virtual story time to the kids in my church or in my community center, and that's meant a lot to me, obviously. But so my first picture book for children is called Maybe God is Like That Too, and it came out a few years ago, and here it is. You know what it looks like, but just to show.
A wonderful book.
Anyway, thank you. Well, in this one, I was asked, my publisher, Beaming Books, had actually approached me and said, we're really looking for a fresh book about the fruit of the Spirit. And for anyone who's not familiar with that, it's verses in the Bible that talk about signs that God's Spirit is in a person, and it's love, joy, peace, patience, and so on. And so I was really thought that was an interesting idea, and I certainly didn't want to write a book that was predictable or sort of like showed a fruit bowl on a suburban kitchen table. And I thought, in what way could I engage with those ideas in a different way? And so I got the idea to sort of create this story about a grandmother who's raising her grandson, and we don't know why, and that's never addressed, but there are a lot of family units that look like that. And so this grandmother is pointing out to this little boy who is wondering, he asks at the beginning of the book, he lives in the city, and it's really New York City, although we don't name it. But he says, I live in the city where the sidewalks and subway cars and buildings and buses are packed with people, but I've never seen God before. And then throughout the book, after his grandmother says, whenever you see love, joy, and peace, God is there. Whenever there's patience, kindness, and goodness, God is there too. When you see faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, that's God's Spirit at work. So then he goes through his day and he sees, taxis, and he sees people walking their dog. He swings on the swings and feels joy, and then he thinks maybe God is like that too. There's actually, and this is good for this sort of contemplative reading time that we're in right now, but there's a spread where he's in school and all the children are reading, and he feels a sense of peace, and he wonders if maybe God is like that too. And so the whole book is sort of, giving different examples of what it might feel like to experience God's presence and God's Spirit. So that was the first one. And then the second one is called Maybe I Can Love My Neighbor Too. And that one, our concept again was that it would be in the same neighborhood as the first book. And so there are some repeat characters. So for people who liked the first book, they can look through and find in the background in different places, they can find different characters from the first story. But this one is all about a little girl who understands that she's meant to love her neighbor, but she wonders who is her neighbor. And if everybody in the world is her neighbor, how in the world can she love that many people? And so, again, she sees examples throughout her day of people being kind, or people stopping to help someone else, or giving food to someone else. And in the end, which I love this spread that the illustrator, whose name is Benjamin Schiffer, he created this really beautiful sort of ending spread, and it sort of has the the idea is all sort of tied up. Every other person in the whole wide world is my neighbor, whether they live next door or across the street or far, far away. And I know I can love my neighbors too. So those two, again, are meant to sort of spark some spiritual curiosity in children, to encourage them to kind of relate to their community in certain ways by showing love to others and serving others. And then there's funny things in them, including the fact that Benjamin Shipper, this illustrator, it just really loves to draw like goofy pictures of dogs. So both books have a lot of dogs. So whenever I read them at preschools or story times at bookstores, kids are always counting the dogs and they're always laughing about what the dogs are doing. And so that's kind of a fun thing about writing picture books, which is so different than writing for adults, is that it really is a collaboration between the illustrator and the author. And so the illustrator brings a whole, another level of humor and other things to the book. So that's been a really fun insight that I've had just doing this the last few years.
What I like about those books so much is that you're dealing with very abstract topics like God and love, that are difficult even for adults to understand, much less children. But you're addressing them pretty directly in terms of, specific examples in their day-to-day lives that they can draw from and see that abstract concept. I think it's just a great learning model.
Oh, thank you. Well, that's my hope, and it's been fun too, because it helps me to dial down on what do these things mean, and where do I see evidence of God's presence in the world, or in what ways can I better connect with my community? Because when you think, like a child, sometimes you can think in a much more clear and less distracted way, which again, in this time where, conferences like your own have been postponed and different speaking engagements that I've had have been postponed or delayed for a year, there's a little more room around the margins for thinking with clarity about what do we want to do? What do we want to create? Who do we want to spend our time with? What are things that truly matter to us? And in a way, there's it's obviously a time of a lot of suffering and uncertainty. And, I'm hearing from friends who are small business owners who are having to, fire half the people in their businesses. And so there's a lot of real pain. There's also an opportunity on the other side of it to really, once again, take a moment, hit pause in our lives and figure out, is the work we're doing what we really want to be doing? Is the work we're doing really bringing us joy or bringing other people joy? It's helped me actually this week as editorial clients have come to me and I've thought, instead of, making a quick response of whether or not I have the time to work with different people, I've been thinking, well, do I really? And I think this already when I'm approached by someone, but even more so, I think, is this something that I really want to help usher into the world? And I'm probably saying no more often than I would have before this time. So, this time is certainly an opportunity for reflection.
Wonderful. So Jen, just like everyone else, your schedule has been dramatically affected, and probably spending your time in different ways and in different locations than what may typically be the case. Do you have any particular spiritual practices or other ways that you're adjusting to all of this?
Yeah, well, I have a every day prior to this as well. I have an app that's called Pray As You Go, and it's an Ignatian sort of daily prayer, and it has a little snippet of music, and then it has a reading from scripture, and then in that sort of Ignatian way, it has sort of a prompt that says, think about whether, being in that room with this scene, or in what ways does this resonate with you? So it's a very sort of open-ended invitation to reflect. And I do that every day anyway, but I've found that it's been really, I have more time not to rush through it, not to do it while I'm, brushing my teeth or, loading the dishwasher. I've been doing it in a more quiet way since everything's been a bit upended. I've also been doing this thing I think I might have mentioned to you before we got on this call. There's a artistic sort of organization called The Secret City. And it was founded by a guy who's an actor and writer, and his name is Chris Wells. And he decided to do, for the duration of this odd time, a daily sort of get together with anyone who wants to be on it. It's on Facebook. It's called The Secret City. And he does a Facebook Live, about 15 or 20 minute reflection on the day. And he presents one word. The words have been things like neighbor, one was anxiety, one was contemplation. And it's all around trying to address this very unsettling time as artists and figure out ways that we can respond and create something new, whether it's a collage, which is something he likes to do, or a poem, which a number of people in this kind of emerging community are doing, or other works of art, music, visual art, and so on. And so it's every day that's kind of giving a little structure to my day. Normally my weekdays are, getting up with my daughter, getting her ready for high school, making her breakfast, kind of starting the day in that way. Now that she's doing her high school online, she's not getting up at 6 a.m. So I'm not needed to make, fried eggs and so on. So doing this artistic practice every day is giving some structure. And then my husband now has moved his whole office at home. And so at the end of the day, when we're done with our work, we've been just taking a long walk around the park. And that gives sort of frame to the day, which I think is helpful. And then I have other, just a lot time for my normal editorial work and for reading and so on. But how about you?
Well, my first reaction when all this happened, first thing I had to do was like readjust and shuffle all my conferences, so that took a very high level of focus, but for a relatively short period of time. Mm-hmm. And then the next thing I thought of was, okay, well, given where we're all at, how can I best serve this audience? The Writing for Your Life group of folks. And so that's why I came up with this webinar series about, reading hope in trying times. It's like, okay, well, if people are at home, maybe they can watch a webinar, whereas they couldn't in the past. And maybe the theme of that webinar could be something that, that could help them, through this, unusual set of challenges that we have right now. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of my first reaction. And, but throughout it all, it reminded me back when I was younger and I worked at AT&T when AT&T was an enormous company. And I would see what happened when there was a crisis. When a big organization like that, or, just even a group within that organization was facing some big crisis, there was this rush of adrenaline and a lot of noise and baggage that may have been there went away. And people got very focused and very active. And so there's still part of that left in me in that, I want to do something. You know what I mean? I don't want to reflect. I'm much less of a reflective kind of a person. I'm much more of a let's get something done kind of a person. So the fact that now I've got this this new webinar series to sink my teeth into, to get them scheduled, to get them recorded, to get the word out there, all that kind of stuff, that's much better for me personally. Is to be busy trying to serve people than it is trying to think through the meaning of life or whatever.
Right. And that's so creative to find different ways to connect with your audience and that's what you're doing with Writing for Your Life, is offering all these resources and opportunities for writers to grow. And then in the face of all this, to give this brand new, shot of adrenaline, like you say. I think that's really creative.
Well, Jen, I want to thank you for spending some time with us today. I think this has been really helpful. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts about children's books and how to help children deal with this. And, we'll be back in touch, I'm sure, for many new endeavors. So stay tuned, right?
Yep.
Bye now.